All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the December webinar. Chad, do you have your computer speakers muted?
I just did, yeah.
Okay. Hey, folks, we've had a little bit of audio issues, but we're on pretty much right on time. So anyway, welcome to the December webinar for the Lake State Fire Science Consortium. I'm Jack McGowan-Stinsky. I'll be moderating the webinar this afternoon. For those who may be joining us for the first time, let me give you a little background. We are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, and we're one of 15 regional consortia, or fire science exchanges, across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, adoption, and sharing of wildland fire science information by federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders across the Lake States and the adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. We strive to be inclusive and neutral science partners working to foster collaboration among researchers and practitioners and organizations and individuals, and by developing innovative approaches to science delivery while facilitating dialogue about new science findings and emerging needs. Before I get started, let's take a few seconds and look at our Adobe Connect webinar interface. To ask a question and interact with the attendees, please use the chat box located in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Make sure that if you type a question, you also click the send button. We'll be monitoring these questions and we'll make sure that there's an opportunity to address them. Currently, Jed and I should be the only ones who are on the phone line, so if anybody was able to call in, we ask that you please either disconnect and use the chat box, or you make sure you mute your phone so that we don't have any feedback issues. All right, if you would like to learn more about the consortium and what we are doing, please visit our website at lakestatesfireside.net. And you can sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements, and can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Now on to today's webinar, Reconstructing Historical Fire Regimes and Forest Structure in Wisconsin's Red Pine-Dominated Forest by Jed Manier. Jed is an ecologist and research scientist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the Bureau of Sciences Services. Jed's work covers an array of topics, but primarily deals with fire ecology. He's a native of Wisconsin, but worked out west for a number of years, including his PhD work at Colorado State University, studying fire ecology in northern Mexico. So with that, let's get to the webinar. Take it away, Jed.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. So what I am going to try to do is give kind of a general overview of two somewhat distinct but very related projects that I'm working on with a number of collaborators, some of whom are listed on this slide. And so one project is really focused more on the structure, historical structure of red pine dominated forests, and then fire history. And really those things obviously interact, and those are part of our questions. So I'm going to sort of give some background of each of those pieces, and then try to combine them with some sort of preliminary results. So let's see. So starting really with the fire history piece. What our goal is we're really trying to reconstruct fire history in Wisconsin over basically the entire state using red pine dominated forests, which incidentally are found everywhere in Wisconsin. Not everywhere, but all over the state. So I've got two pictures here on this title slide and the intro. The one on the bottom is from the Northwest Sands near the Namakagon River, and the one on the right is the Baraboo Hills. And those are both study sites in this project. And so by really covering a large geographic area, we think we can begin to test some of the sort of assumptions we make when trying to understand our fire history. And basic fire regime characteristics like frequency, size, source, severity, those are things that we're interested in. I want to start with a quote that I really like from Aldo Leopold, who in 1933 wrote, "It is astonishing how few of those who've learned by rote, rule, or nature study the statics of land's present inhabitants or condition ever to learn to read the dynamics of its past history and probable future. Leopold goes on to say, to see merely what a forest is or has is to see nothing. To see why it is, how it became, and the direction and velocity of its changes, this is the great drama of the land. And I really, that quote resonates with me. I think it's quite true, and probably true for different reasons. Maybe sometimes it's simply not asking questions. We are just accepting what we see while we're out in the woods. But other times I think we're missing the why and how because maybe we're applying the wrong data or the wrong questions, and I'll try to elaborate on that a little bit. Hopefully, hopefully many of you recognize what's happening in this photo. This again is in the Northwest Sands with a group of people examining an old fire-scarred red pine snag. That cat face, that injury that you see is actually probably records maybe a dozen different fire years or fire events. So we can take partial sections or cross sections of those and date the fire years and learn quite a lot about fire history with these sort of point markers like this. So, you know, maybe just as by way of background, one thing that we know is that we did a pretty good job of eliminating, or nearly so, pine forests in the Great Lakes region. Lee Freelick estimates that 0.6 of relatively intact pines remain. And so a small proportion. We have very little sort of natural origin or old growth pine left. And then what Lee and Lisa Schulte-Moore and others have sort of shown us is that they haven't recovered. We were, you know, when comparing data on pine abundance from the General Land Office records, which I'll talk a little bit more about, to sort of current scenario, we are really basically across the board continuing to lose pine. The relative dominance of pine continues to decline. And I guess it's not surprising then that, you know, we really don't know a lot about these pine systems. They, as a, you know, partially an artifact of what I've just mentioned. Now, I also want to point out that, you know, I picked a photo here that Aldo Leopold took near Plainfield, Wisconsin in the Central Sands in the mid-30s. And I just wanted to point out that while the map, Lisa's map, is dealing with the northern part of the Great Lakes region, this photo is dealing with the Central Sands, as is our investigation. And I think this is interesting. You know, I met with managers in the Central Sands who've worked in the woods for a long time, and they really have no idea that there were even red pine in the Central Sands. So this theme that I'll keep coming back to is this idea of shifting baselines that we always have to be cognizant of. And clearly these stumps in the photo by Leopold are not jack pine. Those are red pine stumps. The other part of this is I think also important to share. And so while pines are basically degraded from what they might have been pre-Euro settlement, and maybe we have certainly have conservation issues around that, we also have a real opportunity. So I was part of an effort to identify areas in Wisconsin that basically represent our greatest opportunity to use fire to maintain fire-dependent ecosystems, called the Wisconsin Fire Needs Assessment. This was an effort led by the Tallgrass Prairie Oak Savanna Consortia, TNC, Wisconsin DNR, all partners in this. And what the effort was, it really looked at using kind of a cost-benefit framework, where are our opportunities to maintain fire-dependent communities. And what you'll notice is, you know, one, that our sort of sandy soils really sort of pop out. But interestingly, the traditional plant communities that we often think about when we think about fire in Wisconsin, oak savanna, tallgrass prairie, those fell really dead last among the communities we looked at. And so the point here is really that, you know, these pine systems, these oak woodlands, forests are really represent opportunities that I think have not had an adequate sort of attention or focus on them. So we have a real opportunity to manage for fire-dependent systems. That picture, Bird's Foot Violet and the Baraboo Hills, look in a red pine relic. Many of you might be surprised that there are such things, but we find these red pine in lots and lots of interesting places. So where I've kind of gotten started in all this is looking at, as a postdoc, I was looking at land fire data. And land fire is trying to model and map all of these different communities in Wisconsin, including lots of these pine systems. Now, what I think is commendable about land fire is they're mapping these systems, but explicit in the mapping and the modeling is this idea of disturbance, particularly fire. So they're building in fire and our understanding of fire when trying to map and understand these systems. You know, but when you think about that, I've got a list of, you know, of several communities up here that are pine communities. They're all Laurentian Acadian, meaning they're above the tension zone, northern Wisconsin or Great Lakes region. And they have their equal counterparts when you get into the central part of Wisconsin or Michigan or Minnesota. So, and then those boundaries aren't always clear. And I'm not sure there's anybody really who can tell you with confidence how fire would interact or what would distinguish one community from another. So that could be a conversation that certainly could take some time with a lot of great minds and is an exercise worth doing. But what really became was sort of I came to recognize in trying to map these things is, you know, we really don't know a lot about many of these systems. And so we're often finding ourselves trying to map them on biophysical settings. So if you have a soil with this kind of moisture range and nutrient range, then maybe it's one versus another. But there's a lot to be learned about these different systems. So I want to pick up just one of these, Laurentian Acadian Northern Pine Oak, for just a second. So using pine oak systems as an example, now Laurentian pine oak is really kind of a default dry pine type in this region. So if it's not coarse outwash sands and should be jack pine, and it's not, you know, more mesic, dry mesic, nutrient-rich site, that would be, you know, northern pine or something. This is kind of the middle that represents really a lot of this region. Landfire has 8 million acres of it mapped in northern Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin alone. And so what Landfire tells us about northern pine oak is that they give us basically the fire regime characteristics that are used in mapping this or understanding it. And, you know, I'm not going to go through all of these in any detail. I'm really just going to touch on a couple points here. But, you know, a lot of this understanding has been imported from elsewhere. And if you start reading between the lines, you can really get a sense of that. So the first 2 points, that it's a fire regime group 3, meaning it has, it kind of fits that Bud Heinzelman story of the boundary waters, that northern Minnesota, where you have maintenance fires every 40 or 50 years and maybe a punctuated stand replacing fire every 250 or 300 years. And part of that reasoning that Bud Heinzelman has used and that we're using to define these is, you know, that pines being able to survive fires, typically they're thinner bark and they're more susceptible to being killed when they're maybe under 50 years old. Now, again, I don't want to go point by point, but I think these those things may be applicable to the boundary waters and may be applicable in northern Minnesota or in some forest types, but by and large, that is not at all what we're seeing in our pine systems. In fact, I have not seen a fire interval in Wisconsin yet approaching 40 years, and we routinely, and I mean it's probably approaching 40% of our samples have fires that are buried in the middle of a sample when the tree was about 1 inch in diameter or 2 inches in diameter, 6 to 10 years old, burned 3/4 of its circumference, healed up just fine and lived for 200 and something years. So that is not uncommon. So both of those points, I think, are just flat wrong. Some of the others are maybe more debatable, but I think they're built on maybe some shoddy information or certainly some assumptions that are worth questioning. One of them is the natural fuel breaks. And there is something to that. I'm not sure I would use inhibit fire spread. I might use the terminology change fire behavior. Some of our best samples we get with 15 fire scars on them are on these narrow isthmus peninsulas or between 2 lakes or 2 big wetlands. And again, that comes down to climate and understanding how these systems burn. But typically, I don't view wetlands as fire breaks. I view them as fuel under different conditions. And then there's a couple other points, and I'll just mention those as well. But let me illustrate them. Oops. So fire size, of course, is a fundamental characteristic of defining any fire regime. And Rich Guyette and Mike Stambaugh and others have done work in northeastern and have a site in northwestern Wisconsin. And based on sort of a quick and dirty fire extent index, they've put together some sort of parameters on what we might expect for fire sizes. 1780 was a big fire year, burned well over 1.2 million acres in the Great Lakes region. This is actually a fire that has historical documentation where for a month it blocked out much of the sun and part of the eastern seaboard. So we know that these sort of big fire years occurred, or we're beginning to get a sense of that. And you know, I put down what land fire estimated as a maximum fire size and the average fire size again in this pine oak system. And you can see that they're orders of magnitude off if we're willing to, you know, go along with this fire extent index, which probably isn't perfect and could use more data, but it's certainly a great start. And just for fun, a little bit as a digression, I've plotted in 1871, and some of you all may recognize that year. 1871 was the year of the Peshtigo fire, which killed approximately 1,500 people. It might, or is, or was the most destructive fire in history based on, at least in North America, based on casualties. And so it's estimated to have burned approximately 1.2 million acres, and then I plotted it with the appropriate Palmer Drought Severity Index. So that's giving us an idea of what the climate was like in these years. And of course, you know, we typically think of the Peshtigo fire as an anomalous fire year and a catastrophic fire. And of course, it was the logging slash, it was the size, it was the severity. But I am not sure that ecologically it was all that unusual of a fire event. In fact, I've been reconstructing fire up in the Northeast Sands where the Peshtigo fire burned, and trees that have lived through that fire didn't record a fire scar. Anyways, while it was catastrophic in terms of human life, I actually would question whether it was all that anomalous in the big picture. So another thing, so one of the sort of assumptions, if you will, of the pine oak fire regime is human ignition. And so I want to just touch on that briefly. The way that we understand what year a fire burned in based on tree rings is quite simple. We just figure out the annual ring that the fire scar is in, and that's That's usually fairly straightforward with a little bit of work. Not only can we determine what year a fire burned in, but we can determine the seasonality of a fire based on the position within the annual ring. So I've kind of illustrated this with a picture, and it's not the best picture because it's actually a late wood fire. Let's see if I can point this out. So if you look at this fire scar, there's the tree, the annual ring, usually you have very big cellular spaces with thin cell walls, and then later in the summer you get the late wood forming, which is thicker cell walls and smaller cellular spaces as the tree goes dormant, and then it goes dormant. Now this fire, actually there's a bit of late wood on either side of this, so this is a late wood fire based on that tree ring position. So what you'll find, the way that we sort of typically analyze this data is we do what's called a superposed epoch analysis. And that's a fancy way of just looking at lag situations. So year 0 is the year of a fire event, and the bar is right around 0. So this is there's no real climate relationship, dry being down, wet being up, for year 0 of a fire. Interestingly, the year prior to the fire is a significantly dry year. And then there was a dry year maybe prior to that, but it's not significant. So this is just a way for us to evaluate fire-climate relationships over time, and looking both ahead of a fire event and afterwards. And this is from Ben Sands and Mark Abrams and the Menominee. And what you'll notice is that the majority of fires, or if you look at Ben and Mark Abrams' work, you'll notice a majority of fires they found are in this dormant season position. So what that means is that the fire is burning between 2 annual rings. And why that's important is because if we attribute a dormant season fire to having burned in the spring, it would go to the next year, which usually is what we do. We assign these fire years to the next year. However, so in this case it would be, this is the year 1762. In a spring fire, it would have burned in this year, early spring before the tree broke dormancy in 1763. Now, if it were a fall fire, we'd attribute it to 1762. So why that becomes important is the Palmer Drought Severity Index, the climate index that we're using, is based basically on calendar years. It's summer drought or summer climate, June, July, August. And so my point is if that fire year were attributed to a spring fire, it would have no climate relationship. If, however, we were willing to entertain the thought that it could have burned in the fall, then indeed the fire year would have been a drought year. So this is just sort of basic fire regime characteristics, basic understanding that we really have been rather haphazard with in many ways, and I think is something that we're going to need to work on. To carry the conversation just a little bit further, one of the main premises of this sort of spring burning and not having a climate signal the year of a fire is that it was primarily native-driven fire rather than lightning, and that it was a quote-unquote intelligent ignition source. And if we're willing to, first of all, I think the sort of discrepancy between lightning and native ignition is kind of meaningless or pointless, but I do think if we're going to get at this idea of climate-fire interactions, we're going to have to evaluate it. Now, if we are to look at first-hand accounts of Native American burning in this region, a colleague of mine who works at the Wisconsin DNR has helped compile a 600-source bibliography, and of the 76 first-hand accounts, which would be pre-Euro settlement, native use of fire or rat settlement, the majority of those fires were being ignited in the fall, not in the spring. In fact, if you look at the spring fires, the majority of those were being set by settlers during settlement period. So it was really a shift in fire use between natives and settlers when you're going from fall to spring. And there's some evidence, at least, that maybe the term Indian summer has some bearing on this, that it was not uncommon to have, prolonged dry periods after perhaps a killing frost in the fall when you had huge areas of the Great Lakes region burning. So even if we're not, ignoring the sort of native versus lightning ignition piece for just a moment, if we're just going to drill down into native ignition, we're probably assigning those fire years, those spring fires, to the wrong year in our sort of climate fire analyses. And this is something we've got to resolve, or at least be cognizant of. So I want to switch gears for just a moment now. So that's a little bit of background on some of the fire regime characteristics, using pine oak as one example of kind of a lot to learn. So I want to talk a bit about forest structure as well, and of course these things are related. So we're interested in questions about the pre-Euro settlement structure of red pine across a moisture gradient. So we want to understand the range of variability in these red pine dominated forests. And again, and how does structure relate to fire regime and vice versa? I would add climate as well. So we can learn a lot about climate-fire interactions by examining recruitment, tree recruitment, and stand structure, in addition to just understanding fire alone. And the way that we've gone about, the way we know what we know, really, in many respects about pre-Euro settlement vegetation is from the General Land Office Public Land Survey records. I won't go into any detail on this, but it's essentially it was a survey to parcel out the public good and sell it to the private domain. And this survey in Wisconsin occurred between about 1832 and 1866, depending on where you were in the state. And it's really a pretty good record of the vegetation that was there based on witness trees in order to mark section corners. So it's sparse data, but it's uniformly collected and it's over a huge spatial scale. So it's been quite valuable in many ways. So one thing I like to do is show this picture, and I'm not sure how well it's showing for you. It's kind of a washed out picture, but if you look, this is an image from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and if you look, there's in the foreground there are people standing next to these trees. It's a mixed pine forest, and what I like to do is I like to ask folks when I give presentations what they think this forest is. Is it a savanna structure? Is it a woodland structure? Or is it forest? And usually you get some of each, really, leaning towards forest or woodland. And so if we use, I'm not particularly interested in these cutoffs or what defines a savanna from a woodland, because really those are arbitrarily defined, or at least there's plenty of gray area there. But I am interested in this idea of structure, and particularly structure in terms of how we can understand process or processes like fire. And if there are probably those of you out there that are much more spatially inclined than I am, that might have some sense of the scale of this picture. But I'm guessing that that this picture is probably somewhere on the light end of 100 trees per hectare, so it's pushing towards forest. One thing you'll notice about this picture is that if you look closely, I think I've identified a bunch of fire scars there, as well as charring on some of the bark. So clearly we have, even in this forest, it's fairly open. Looks like a pretty good herbaceous understory, not a lot of brush, very high canopy base heights, lots of sun hitting the ground. My point being that even in our sort of forest, fire was an important process. And when we look at that in relation to the General Land Office notes, so this is from Bollinger et al. That really looks at individual species and their density, again based on those GLO notes. If you come over here to bur oak, of course, we have associated with savanna, which, this is closed forest, open, savanna, and prairie. Bur oak is almost entirely savanna, which makes sense. Maybe a little bit of it is open enough to be considered prairie. What I think is interesting about this is that if you look at jack pine and red pine, the majority of jack pine and red pine are in these more open forests. They would be the jack pine barrens, but red pine as well. And even white pine, a lot of white pine was in this closed forest, but there's a lot of it as well that's in more of this open sort of structure. And so, when we look at that spatially, we know that at least half the state was or about half the state was fairly open conditions. And then what really interests me is what about the other half as well? What were those forests like? And they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, here's a picture of maybe what we were seeing a minute ago. This is a paper by Andy Stoltman, who is in DNR Forestry, and colleagues, and they have given us a visualization of what that might look like in both a more productive, richer environment, more of a closed forest, and also in the northwest part of the state, and a couple of landscapes that would be much more savanna, much more barrens and open. And then using FIA data, forest inventory analysis data, compared to the General Land Office data, we get some idea of those changes over time. And not surprisingly, you get some pretty drastic changes in forest structure, particularly in these open sort of savanna landscapes. And the Bayfield Plains have basically a 100-fold increase in density. And within that, the Siren Plains have shifted to hardwoods, and really jack pine is no longer present. So not only are you getting a change in structure, you're also getting a change in species composition. So I'm interested also in these sort of, these closed forests being 184 trees per hectare, 191, and what that, what we're seeing with those, and what that can tell us in terms of process. So certainly the General Land Office data has limitations. It's great for understanding, broad spatial scale trends that like we were just seeing. But when we start to try to get a better sense of processes of disturbance like fire, I would say certainly has limitations. And so if we look at a paper by Lisa Schulte and Dave Mladenoff, where they've reconstructed fire rotation intervals for Wisconsin, really, jack pine, red pine, and white pine. So a fire rotation interval, of course, is a little bit different than a fire return interval, which would be shorter. But even then, thinking about fire rotation intervals on the order of 3,000 years, I think I could find lakes in Wisconsin that burned more frequently than every 3,000 years. And I'm not even kidding when I say that. So I'm not, this data is probably not well suited to these questions, or at least it has limitations. And so another way of thinking about it, the old adage, if you ask the wrong questions, you don't have to worry about the answers. And what I mean by that is fire rotation. So this is severe sort of stand replacing fire, which would have been basically the only fires that the General Land Office surveyors could have picked up with any regularity. We're probably infrequent and rare. But what I think is important about that is that fire was ubiquitous. It was frequent and it was missed. And that fire wasn't, of course, stand replacing severe fire. It was the low severity, high frequency fire. So, so we can calculate fire rotation intervals. I think that you know, that the data is probably not well suited really to understanding, you know, these finer scale processes, disturbance, that are more frequent. Another way that we can sort of understand structure and by extension fire is by looking for old growth pine, old growth forests. Of course, they're limited. Here is some work done by Sean Fravor and Brian Pollock, where they reconstructed stand structure, visiting sort of these old growth, natural origin red pine in 7 sites in Minnesota. And this is a really neat paper and work. And so they get, you know, the mean trees per hectare that they come up with are about twice as dense as those reconstructed from the General Land Office notes by Andy Stoltman and others. And so one thing that, you know, as I've been looking around at sites and starting to collect data, that I've recognized is typically the natural origin older growth red pine are limited to more of the dry mesic sites. They're more of the productive sites. In general, the true dry red pine dominated sites are very, very rare. And so what I think is important here is that we've, you know, by looking at empirical data of old forests, we're probably getting a pretty narrow picture of what that was like, you know, limited to sort of more of the dry mesic sites that are more typical in northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota. And so, and then the saplings per hectare, I think that is something that, you know, we see frequently, and that's also worth paying attention to. One thing I'll add real quick, you know, as we look around, so I've been to a lot of state natural areas in the state of Wisconsin, a lot of quote-unquote old growth red pine and pine. By and large, big red pine are older than big white pine, and oftentimes the trees are, as is true with Sean and Brian's work in Minnesota, many of these sites are, you know, the trees are about 200 years old, 180, 200. There are older sites, and Sean and Brian found some. But by and large, you know, we're dealing with sites that while old and are definitely pre-Euro settlement, they have lived most of their existence in the absence of fire, which was the process that would have been the primary driving force in those systems. So what we're beginning to do is to try to reconstruct fire history and stand structure for a few sites. So the black dots are all fire history sites, and then the black squares are areas where we're putting in half-hectare plots, and we're stem mapping, and we're collecting spatially explicit data and stem mapping all of the remnant and also all of the old living trees, so we can start to get a sense of spatial structure. What we're able to do is we're able to not be restricted by looking at remnant wood. We're able to reconstruct stand structure based on the historical forest that was all cut down. So those sites, I should say, are really selected carefully, where we think that they were harvested and left alone, and that most or all of the remnant wood is still intact in there. Some of it we may not be able to date, much of it we are able to date. And so we're about halfway done with both of these projects, and to date in the projects we've collected about 436 cross-sections, fire-scarred cross-sections, and over 2,300 cores from stands for stand structure information. And so the data basically that we've started to we've cross-dated and are analyzing first are the three circled sites on this map: Finnerude Pines, Camp Bird, and Snow Bottom. Again, I have the tension zone here drawn as a pretty fine line, but we're really interested in sites that sort of cover the different ecological landscapes of Wisconsin that are in the north of the tension zone, south of the tension zone, along the tension zone, which of course is a climatically defined region. So we're able to really generate hypotheses using sort of detailed local fire histories over a broad spatial geography. And so, you know, we're collecting sites that are really quite different. So we're able to start to test hypotheses about topography, about ignition source. So this is an example of relic red pine that we're sampling in the Baraboo Hills and in the Driftless area. And then this is, of course, a very different landscape, the Central Sands, which is the ancient glacial lake bed from Glacial Lake, Wisconsin, which is really a peneplain. So we're sampling red pine here, which you could start to already imagine how you might generate hypotheses around that just on fire behavior alone. And then up north is a whole other beast, and we're again sampling across a range of moisture and a range of topography and trying to get a better handle on some of these factors in defining fire regimes. So I've already mentioned the stand structure. We're using half-hectare plots, which is kind of the minimum area needed to capture the spatial variability in these stands. And you know, we're able to generate some really cool hypotheses around this. So if you can imagine, you know, so this picture here is from the tension zone, and this is a site where, for example, the living trees are old red pine. They again they regenerated after harvest, and they basically grown up without fire for the last 120 to 150 years. Now, so if we were to if we were able to make comparisons now to the remnant material that you see in the foreground, so one hypothesis could be if climate were the controlling mechanism in regeneration and competition were sort of the force at play, you might expect a random distribution of those living trees. And then we're able to do the same thing for the historical material that, of course, did not only originate but grew in the presence of repeated surface fires. So we're able to start to generate hypotheses looking at the variability both within and among sites with this more detailed sampling design. And so, again, we really have just the sort of preliminary pieces of our data analyzed. We came out of the field about a month and a half ago, and we've been sanding and processing wood and beginning to cross-date. But these are preliminary results, and this is seasonality. So this is the fire scar position. Now, one thing that I didn't mention, so this site, actually it was a site we were sampling, we've been sampling tree cores throughout basically the growing season, starting in early spring before trees broke dormancy, all the way through to late fall when they were dormant again. And what we've noticed is that even in southern Wisconsin, the trees that we're sampling in late June and even early July have yet to begin forming an annual ring. So when we're looking at fire scar position in the southwest of the United States or the west, an early wood position fire scar means something probably very different than it does in Wisconsin. So this has really been quite interesting for us. So an early wood fire is probably, we're talking about a July fire. So we're talking about growing season. So seasonality is something that we've got a lot of work left to do. We're really only going to be able to start tackling that as we put more and more sites into this picture with more data. But we would expect, for example, that if we're looking at with the finer, flashier fuels that can dry out more readily in the southern part of Wisconsin, we would expect more growing season fires in the savanna and prairie parts of Wisconsin than we would say up in the northern part. And we are beginning to see that patterns like that. You can get a sense also that the fire return interval is very short, and we only have one site thus far analyzed in southern Wisconsin, but what we're seeing with snow bottom in the driftless area is that there was a lot of asynchronous fires, and that's another thing we can begin to test now is the synchronicity of these fires. And if we're talking about climate-controlled fires up north versus more flashier fuels that dry out more quickly in the south, we'd expect to see some differences there. This is a picture that, if anybody's been in the woods, probably doesn't need explanation. We are getting, actually these are stems. Oh no, they're seed stock, that's right. So we do have a conservation problem. This is similar to Sean Fravor and Brian Pollock's findings and others. We really are not getting pine regeneration for the most part. Interestingly, in Snow Bottom, which is the southwestern Wisconsin site, we seem to be getting more pine regeneration than some of our northern sites. So these are trends that, as we add data to, we'll be able to start to pull out some interesting pieces. We've also made an attempt to sort of look at historical versus current tree density. So we have pulled out the red pine and attempted, based on remnant stumps and snags that we have in our plots, we've taken our best estimate at what probably would be missing in that data and excluded it from the current structure. So we're doing our best in these first two bars to compare apples to apples here and looking at historical versus current tree density. And again, this is that Snow Bottom site. This is southwestern Wisconsin, where we seem to have an increase in density of red pine, which is quite interesting. And then we have the current stand composition. And so when we look at Snow Bottom, this is a site, that is pretty interesting to us. And we see sort of a pulse of regeneration. Now, if we're trying to interpret this, so again, I have on the very top of this, I have Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is an index of drought, and it has a cubic spline smoothing function set to it. You'll notice, for example, 1664 is right here. That was one of the most pronounced droughts in Wisconsin in hundreds of years, so that shows up quite well. And we've got a pulse of regeneration around 1870. And of course, if we were just to interpret this, it's centered on a drought, which is interesting. And it also comes after basically fires ended in this site. And so that's not surprising, but again, I think we'll probably need more data to look at that. What is surprising to me, though, is when you look at the red pine regeneration over time, it seems to be recruiting well into the current period. Camp Bird, this is really an old growth site up in the northeast sands. It's actually quite a spectacular site, and it had very frequent fire. You'll notice in this data, I should point out, so this is the number of trees recruiting, and these are separate data from the stumps, or in this case snags, that we collected. So there was definitely a big period of recruitment here around 1750, which was a climatically wet period. But anyways, and this isn't terribly surprising. And then we have a period of rather frequent fire. Each one of those ticks is an individual fire event, and the widespread fires are marked in years, if you can make that out. And so we have basically frequent fire and little regeneration. Again, we've got this blip in the 1950s, which I find is interesting. And then the last site that we've really started to summarize data for is Finnerud Pines near Minocqua in the Northern Highlands. And again, you know, it's we have another sort of cohort of red pine that regenerated around 1840, and this is kind of an in-between story. While Camp Bird regenerated in drought and Snow Bottom regenerated in a climatically wet period, this one's a little bit different. And again, it's a fairly pronounced regeneration event, recruitment event. And then over time, again, I'll just point out, I'm not sure what's happening here really, but we're getting this showing up in our data now. In 1950, there was a little blip of red pine regeneration. So it's going to take more data really to start to tease these relationships out more and over a broad geographic area. And then this is a bit of a digression, but has anyone seen this before? This is there were a handful of trees at Finnerud that had these rocks stacked up into the old burn scars that then healed over them. And that was new to me, but fascinating. And so to try to wrap up some of these thoughts, our sort of fire ecology and management in this region, the Great Lakes region, is very much rooted in a biophysical settings paradigm. So we have, for many years, tried to tie vegetation to fire, to soils, to all these things, climate, but you know, surprisingly, we've not gone out and actually collected the fire history, which is here. That's been very surprising to me. So I think we can start to refine some of these questions and some of our findings that we've come up with using the General Land Office notes and other sources of data. And so I really think it's an exciting time. I do think we have to start looking at fire history in this region more holistically than basically finding fire history for a local site and fitting a story of human history and other things that fit to it. There's the human history in this state, in this region, is exceedingly complex. It was a moving target continually, and the only way, in my opinion, we're going to really be able to say anything with certainty, particularly around fire and climate, is to start to explicitly state and test these sorts of assumptions. And so, you know, another point is that we really do have an opportunity now to think outside the box. And I think we're entering, hopefully, a new sort of paradigm where we begin to think about managing fire-dependent systems other than prairie and savanna. We have lots of fire-dependent systems in this state, in this region, and anyways, that's we definitely have an opportunity there. And you know, I've poked at this a little bit, but one thing I'm becoming more and more sure of is that fire was a ubiquitous process in Wisconsin systems. We think of wetlands as fire breaks. I think that's probably somewhat erroneous. I think we need to think of wetlands as fuels under different conditions. And so to come up with you know, 5,000-year fire rotation intervals or 1,000-year fire return intervals in northern hardwoods, I'm fairly confident that for every northern hardwood stand that you can find with a 1,000-year fire return interval, I can find 10 that had a more frequent return interval. And so, lastly, we have a lot of work left to do, both within this data set and as a fire community. I want to sort of end with a quote from Leopold that I really have come to appreciate. He says, "We're dealing right now with a fraction of a cycle involving centuries. We cannot obstruct or reverse a cycle, but we can bend it. In what degree remains to be shown." And this is in a paper that Leopold wrote in 1924, where he had, at that point, it was grass brush timber fire in southeast Arizona. It was one of the one of his strongest statements on the need for fire. Like his views on predators, his attitudes on fire evolved and changed over time. And he, at being the prolific writer he was, we have a pretty good window of that. And so this quote, I think, fits in Wisconsin. I don't think we're ever going to see fire on the landscape like we had pre-Euro settlement, nor is it necessarily desirable. But I think we can be smarter about the way we manage and use fire, and I think we can definitely start applying some of these things to pine systems in the state, beyond barrens and beyond, in the southern part of the state, oak savanna and tallgrass prairie. And with that, I realize I haven't looked at the notes for a while, and we've got about 5 minutes maybe. Thank you, and if you've got, go ahead.
Yeah, we can certainly go beyond.
Okay, yeah, if you have questions, I can be around. So that's a very general overview.
I'm sorry, Jed, go ahead.
Oh, that's just a real sort of general overview of the work that we're doing, some of the things that we're working on and are interested in. But I would be curious to hear from others.
All right. Well, just remind folks, if you have questions, type them in the chat box. We do have some coming in now. John Blakeman asked why we're at pre-settlement time. And
so, John, that's a great point. So in that bibliography that Rich and others helped put together, it's primarily related to hunting. And so that was the most frequently documented reason for fire use by natives. And there are a lot of descriptions of circle fires they would light, and they would basically stand around the perimeter, and as game fled, they would spear it. So hunting it is, and if you just thinking about this logically, you can procure and store meat better in the fall than you can in the spring. You've got then spring green up to attract animals. So to me, intuitively, it makes perfect sense why you would have more fire ignited in fall by natives. Right. However, that's my intuition, really. But yes, the bibliography does point that out. It was primarily for hunting. And that, I bet it does apply in Ohio.
Looks like we got a few people typing, so let some questions filter in. Jed, you referred a couple times to kind of your next steps, and you're not done yet with the project. Could you kind of highlight what those next steps are then?
I'm sorry, Jack. Go ahead again. I was reading Kurt's message there, or question.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead and answer Kurt's, and then I'll ask it.
Okay. So great question, Kurt. It is a difficult process, and I don't know that we're ever going to get it exactly right. But I think one thing that we're starting to explore with our data as we lock in our cross-dating and our dating in general is to take the traditional approach and assign dormant season fires to the spring of the year, and then run your climate fire sort of analyses, and then go back to the data. So if 74% of fire ignitions were in the fall, according to first-hand accounts, maybe we could randomly select from those dormant years 75% of them and attribute them to the fall of the year, rerun those climate analyses and see what we get. So that's one way. I think a bigger picture, so again, we have, if we start collecting data across large regions, we can actually begin to talk about a story in relation to native populations and changes. So that alone can help that. But that's more of a general point. I do think we have to maybe get, I would like to see more work on sort of the histology and phenology of ring formation, and that's something that I'm very interested in. So there are ways to begin to poke at that, but you're right, it is a difficult problem, and there's no mistaking that. And so we have, for the data that you've seen here, the preliminary stuff that I've shared, we're taking the traditional approach and we're assigning between ring fires to the spring, so it'd be the latter year. And that's just for, I mean, we are really just beginning to look at data. In fact, we'd probably be only, you know, we've really only been looking at pieces of wood for maybe 6 weeks.
All right, so John Blakeman asks implications for modern stand management.
Yeah, well, again, you know, there are two pieces of this, and you know, the stand structure information I think is really important. So if you can imagine, as they're finding out in western landscapes, when you have fire mitigation efforts to thin, say, ponderosa forest to some stems per hectare or basal area. And what you end up with in a lot of cases is you have this sort of uniform, almost like a thin plantation look to it. And I think when you get enough wind and you get crown fire, you actually can still sustain crown fire. So fire behavior is one part of this, and wildfire risk and hazard. What out west they're finding now, and there's work going on with this that I've actually participated in, is looking at the clumpy groupy structure. So if you have the same basal area or the same stems per hectare, but in a different spatial configuration, that may have, with, you know, small little meadows and openings, that could have more to do with changing fire behavior than the number of stems per hectare. So there are those kinds of applications. I also think, you know, we have a lot of our pines that are planted in rows, of course, were planted by the CCC in the 30s and 50s, and they're at rotation age. I would like to see maybe at least data efforts at looking at, you know, longer-term rotations of red pine, and so anything we can learn about historical structure, growth rates, which is another thing that I'm looking at for an unrelated project. It all kind of comes together to give us a better sense of holistic red pine management and regeneration when we put the fire piece in there. Okay, I've lost track here.
So yeah, Kurt has two kind of responses. The first one, it's right after the question about the implications.
So Kurt, yeah, ring width doesn't start until late. It could be fall or spring. Well, I mean, it could be. So I think one easy take-home from what we're finding is that an early wood ring fire is probably a midsummer fire. That alone is valuable information. I think if you start to look at the other pieces, so one thing I've done is I've looked at 10 years of climate data and prescribed burn windows, and I've also looked at precipitation. And basically, we have more frequent and more total precipitation in the spring months than we do the fall. We have more drying periods and longer drying periods in the fall. And by all of those metrics, by temperature, relative humidity, wind, and precipitation, basically, I'm finding that fall is a more suitable time for fire than spring. And if we look at projections of climate, maybe this is you know, this is changing the focus a little bit, but it doesn't all have to be on, you know, we need to think about our going forward as much as we do going back. It's getting harder and harder to do prescribed burning in the spring, and we're projected to get wetter and more variable spring and winters, and we're projected to get droughtier summers, and falls are anybody's guess, but so far it looks like that might be not only a window, but the only window going forward. So those are things that I've been thinking about.
So to keep you on track, so John Blake can ask any related implications for or findings for oak stands?
Well, so John, you know, so we are sampling, we're getting our fire history via red pine in the southwest, but we have sites in the driftless area, we have sites in the Baraboo Hills, we have sites in the Wisconsin Dells, We have sites at Quincy Bluff, and those are really, to some degree, all oak systems. So yes, I think we're going to be able to say an awful lot about fire and oak systems. In fact, I think we'll have a really fantastic data set to talk about that.
All right, and then if you scroll down, it's a question about the fire needs assessment.
Yeah, what things did you consider and how are they weighted to arrive at your plant community ranking? So the fire needs assessment, it used a cost-benefit framework. So things like effort were part of the cost. And effort could be the number of times it would need to be burned to be maintained in a given period. And then there were things like the WUI and the WIC, you know, how large and how intact the landscape. So real things that you face as a fire manager trying to keep fire on a landscape were part of the costs. And then benefits came from the wildlife action plans, and so rarity was maybe part of the equation, but unlike, you know, when you think about oak savanna as being the most endangered ecosystem in the world, and if you're going to manage something, that's what you're going to manage for. That's a rarity, you know, that's based on rarity alone. So the fire needs assessment, it had that component to it, but it looked at a lot of different pieces. It's not perfect, but at a big scale, I think it was good to get us thinking more sort of broadly. John, nice to see your name. Having greater historical presence. Yeah, thank you. Yep, it's I really I look at some of the fire return intervals for different systems, and I mean I can't tell you how many times I see like a tiny little stringer of upland in the middle of a huge wetland complex. And of course up in Seney, there's been work done in red pine stringer system up there. Those systems were burning. They were burning in drought years, and they weren't burning all that infrequently. So to view wetlands as a fire barrier is probably a mistake.
And then just to follow up with the fire needs assessment, Craig Meyer, who's the program coordinator with the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium, because they help lead the fire needs assessment, he provided the link there.
Perfect. Thank you, Craig. That'll correct things that I've said, I'm sure, and definitely be a little more eloquent. But that's great. It's worth checking out.
Well, let's see if any more questions come rolling in. One of the questions I had was just, you know, you mentioned a couple different times like different steps or the next steps, and could you kind of reiterate real quickly what those steps are for this continuing project?
Yeah, so we're about halfway done with our data collection. We're expecting to have, I don't know, maybe 900 cross sections over much of the state of Wisconsin and lots of stand structure information. We're, you know, right now we're plowing through a mountain of wood. We've got it almost entirely prepped, surfaced, and we're rolling on the cross dating. So we're making good progress. But so the immediate steps are to get through what we've got, and then we're going to be out collecting another pile of data in the near future. So this project is really getting going. Now, one thing I would like to see, you know, I know Evan and Kurt and others are working in different areas, and I think we really should get together and talk about, you know, how we can systematically evaluate some of the issues I've raised or that we've all talked about or encountered, and not only just issues, but, you know, how can we make sense of our data collectively and then think strategically about filling in some of those gaps. So it's an exciting time, definitely, and there are a lot of neat things happening around the region.
That's an excellent plug for coordination.
Yep.
So let's see, John asked, any findings on fire frequency and forb densities and species complex trends?
Let's see, any findings on fire frequency and forb densities and species? John, I've not looked at that. that's, we haven't been really doing herbaceous species inventorying, or I have not looked at that. But as I think there is room for that as we start trying to use fire more in different systems. That's a good point.
It looks like you have Kurt agreeing that there's a good chance for collaboration.
Yeah.
We got a few more people typing, so let's see what pops up here.
All right. So.
You see that, Jed?
Yeah. Looks like Dell's they've got a project, similar fire project going on. Well, that's great. Thank you for your contact info. I'll drop you a note. Thank you, Adele. John, could I speak more about the presence of fire evidence in young red pine, especially survivability and management implications? I actually haven't scrolled through the list, but I gather that Evan's been looking at that, maybe Evan Larson at UW-Platteville, and maybe with Kurt. I know that's just a guess, but we haven't quantified that with our own data or samples. But honestly, John, I do not have to sift through my samples to find lots of examples where you have a tree, a stump that we've got a cross-section from, and it's 6 years old when it burns and it survives. Now, one thing I will say is that I'm sure a fire like that probably took out a lot of its peers, a lot of seedlings and saplings and young trees. But I don't think that we ought to be defining fire regimes based on when we think trees can survive a fire, because that just doesn't apply, I don't think. So we'll have data to look at that soon. So Kurt chimed in, great. We have some limited quantification and are seeing very small trees scarred very early, like you're seeing. Yep, great, Kurt, thank you. That's good to know.
I think that helped answer John's question above. So.
Yep. Yeah, and yep, that was really Bud Heinzelman's, one of his contributions, I think, and I don't think it's wrong everywhere, but it's certainly not right everywhere.
All right. Well, we do have somebody else typing, so let's see if there's any questions coming in. Jed, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, since you're in the middle of this project. When you kind of wrap it up, I would hope you would be willing to come back and do a webinar for Lake States and Sawgrass Prairie for all the audience to kind of show the new findings or the next step.
Yeah, that would be great, Jack. I'd welcome the opportunity.
Excellent. So, all right. And John just asked another question. Let's see. Do deer and elk populations play any roles in regeneration?
That I was looking at. So really, we're only just starting to get preliminary results, and I've been thinking about that. So we're collecting seed sap data in all of our plots, and we're going to, of course, have tree cores. So we're going to have pretty good information about that over a large spatial area. And maybe there's a way to play with deer numbers over time, and look at some of our data with an eye on that. We haven't done so yet. There are higher deer densities in the south than there are the north, and that varies, regionally within those larger regions. And so there are ways we could probably evaluate that at a very sort of coarse level, which I think would be worth thinking about. Intuitively, I do think deer could be having an impact, but when I look at the changes in stand structure over time, and when I look at an area like Camp Bird, which is in Marinette County in the Northeast Sands, that is a relatively intact pine forest, and it's just not. Even the mature trees, the 276-year-old pine cohort, are not doing well. They're beginning to break up, and it's because of shade and they're just getting crowded with shade tolerance and other things. So while deer are definitely a part of the picture, I think we're not even getting to where we can evaluate that in a lot of cases. It's just too shaded. We just need to introduce fire back into those systems. So I didn't point this out, but that stump in the picture right there, that's up in Clark County, and that thing I think had 26 fire scars on it. Doesn't look like much, but it was a gem, and we're finding those in lots of spots. And then look at the forest in the background.
Wow, neat. Well, yeah, I don't see any more questions rolling in. Folks, if you got any more, go ahead. Otherwise, Jed, I will kind of wrap this up. We'll wait and see if there's any more questions. So, again, thank you for the very informative webinar, and thank everyone online for joining us this afternoon. If you would like to review the webinar or share with someone that might be interested but missed it, I'll have a recording of this webinar on the Lake States Fire Science Consortium webpage later this afternoon. Let me toggle over here. The next webinar we have, which is in January, is going to be Fire and Aspen in the Lake States by Lee Freilich. He's the director of the University of Minnesota Center for Forest Ecology. And it looks like Evan Larson just said, thanks, Jed. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jack.
Yep. So with that, we'll wrap this up. And again, appreciate it a lot, Jed, and everyone for participating. So have a good rest of the day.